introductions and moderating today. Thank you, Nick.
Can everyone hear me? All right. Thanks so much for being here today for the third talk in Goetz Fair Housing Symposium. For those who don't know me, my name is Nick Kelly, and I'm a PhD in the department. And for those of you who weren't here last week, these talks examine HUD's new affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, which aims to realize the promise of the 1968 Fair Housing Act. By requiring localities to identify patterns of segregation and disparities in access to opportunity, the rule represents an unprecedented opportunity to transform the geography of opportunity in the United States and create truly integrated neighborhoods. The symposium sets out to explore the promise and perils of the new rule, looking at the issue from a different perspective during each talk. Last week, we got the symposium off to a whirlwind start with two talks, first examining the racial biases of homebuyers, and second, how the new rule affects local governments. In addition to faculty and students, we were so pleased to have a number of practitioners from the Boston area at last week's talks, and I'm happy to see more again today, because this week we turn our attention to the impact of the new rule on community developers, a crucially important topic of interest to scholars, practitioners, and most importantly, communities in Boston and across the country. The implications of HUD's new fair housing rule for community development are not at all clear, and that's why we're so lucky today to have one of the nation's foremost experts on community development and public housing, Professor Ed Goetz. Ed is professor at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, where he serves as director of the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs at the University of Minnesota and co-director of the University Metropolitan Consortium. He is the author of a number of books that have made a significant contribution to the study of public housing, community development, and urban policy, including New Deal ruins, race, economic justice, and public housing policy, as well as Clearing the Way, deconcentrating the poor in urban America. His work also examines the tensions between community development and mobility strategies, a particularly relevant topic for today's discussion. We're thrilled to have him here today. We're also very pleased to have as a discussant David Harris, Managing Director of the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice at Harvard Law School. Prior to Harvard, he served as founding executive director of the Fair Housing Center of Greater Boston. During his tenure, the Fair Housing Center became nationally recognized for its analyses of housing discrimination patterns in Greater Boston. David is recognized as a leading voice for civil rights in the Boston region, having previously served with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development and with the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. And he currently chairs the Massachusetts Advisory Committee to the Civil Rights Commission. Given his extensive on-the-ground experience in fair housing, both nationally and locally, we're very excited to have him at today's talk. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. It's a real pleasure for me to come to Boston to talk about these issues. And I'll just jump right in. We want to talk about fair housing and the affirmatively furthering rule in the context of increasingly contentious relations between fair housing advocates on the one hand and community developers on the other. Typically, NIMBYism is a regular part of the life of a community developer, the life of an affordable housing developer. And typically, opposition to affordable housing will come from nearby property owners, business owners, people who foresee all sorts of terrible outcomes should the affordable housing be built. But these terrible outcomes are typically rising crime rates, declining property values. They may couch their opposition in terms of increasing densities and the problems that these types of developments would bring to communities. Increasingly, community developers find themselves confronted from another side as well. And that is from fair housing activists who look at a prospective affordable housing development and oppose it because of its impacts in maintaining or perpetuating patterns of segregation within disadvantaged communities. Coming to the typical city council meeting, community developers need to be ready for arguments from both sides related to their proposed development. I think what I want to talk about is to set the context for this debate between community developers and fair housing advocates, because it's of course quite different than the debate that community developers have with the typical kind of NIMBY argument. This is a debate largely between allies, in the sense that these are two movements that share many goals of racial equity, social justice, but find themselves disagreeing about particular strategies. It's a debate that's long-standing, frankly, that one can look at evidence of mid-20th century largely African-American communities and see the leaders of those communities already realizing, already understanding that public housing is being segregated in their neighborhoods, but understanding also that that public housing is providing a very important and needed resource in those communities as well. So this tension has been around for decades. There's nothing really new about it. I will say that it's probably at a higher stage now, and I argue that it's at a higher stage now, a more intense stage, because the fair housing movement has shifted its strategy to what I characterize as a more aggressive spatial strategy, and I'll talk more about what I mean by that in a minute. And in fact, there have been a lot of things going on in the last several years that have brought this issue to a head. And then finally, I'll finish by talking about the implications of this tension and this conflict for a number of different planning issues beyond simply where to site affordable housing or housing and community development activities. All right, so we begin by quickly characterizing the two frames. This is really a question of a problem of disagreement about location of affordable housing. At a very minimum, that's what this is about. This is fundamentally a question of whether affordable housing can play some kind of positive role within a community and help a community revitalize itself, or whether it's a burden to a community that should be more widely dispersed throughout a metropolitan area, so as not to burden the community, but also so as to provide the residents of such housing with a greater variety of opportunities. It's also, this also represents, I think, divergent approaches to how to achieve racial justice. Again, at a fundamental level, there's a difference of opinion about the relative importance of integration versus self-determination, community power as a way of achieving greater justice in the racial policy arena as well. And so I'll talk about those as well. I want to begin with reference to a book by a couple of political scientists on what they call racial policy and alliances, which they define as described above. And they identified two different alliances that are dominant in the United States. The first being the colorblind policy alliance, and the second being the race-conscious policy alliance. The first, and these, since the 1970s, have aligned themselves pretty neatly with the two major political parties in the United States, with Republicans really resorting to these ideas about that our race policy needs to be colorblind, that if we essentially take color out of and race out of the formula altogether and treat everyone equally, then we will have accomplished what we need to in the field of race relations. Versus the race-conscious policy, which argues that one needs to take into account existing and long-standing inequalities that still find themselves and still exhibit themselves in our institutions, in our policy processes as well. And so in response to that, we really need to be conscious about race, and we need to be consciously addressing these inequalities that exist in the system. What King and Smith argue is that there is significant internal diversity within these two alliances. And my argument today is that, in fact, what we see between fair housing and community development is a tension within the race-conscious policy alliance. All right, so this is not an argument between colorblind policy and race-conscious policy. This is a disagreement about strategies within a race-conscious policy alliance, where you have affordable housing and community development advocates who are first and foremost concerned about meeting housing needs, about improving communities through the development of housing in concert with other types of investments within the community on the one hand, and then fair housing advocates on the other, who are first and foremost concerned with racial equity in housing and patterns of long-standing patterns of discrimination, segregation, and integration. I don't need to belabor this point. I will say that this notion, this conflict between integration on the one hand and what I'm calling access, the access problem of housing, as I said, is of long standing. Back in the 1940s, less than 10 years after the public housing program was created, in the very first decade of assisted housing for low-income people in the United States, you can find evidence, as I said, of leaders in the black community talking about this choice that they've been given. The choice of accepting segregated assisted housing on the one hand, or getting nothing in the housing market on the other. Either meeting needs in the community through accepting this segregated pattern of housing, or not being able to meet those needs at all. And this is I think an issue that has endured over the decades. It expressed itself during the 50s and the 1960s in the debate between mainstream civil rights activists and community control or black power advocates related to exactly what is the best strategy for achieving racial justice, and how much how much importance should we put on issues of integration, spatial integration, housing integration, as well as economic integration and political integration as well. There's an interesting book called The Geography of Malcolm X, in which his thoughts and his ideas are sort of extended from this viewpoint of what it meant for communities, and so this is an example of a quote from that. This controversy was exhibited throughout the 1970s through various controversies about where to put assisted housing, and the Shannon versus HUD decision in 1970 requiring HUD to have a plan for where it sited its housing so that it wouldn't continue to site assisted housing in minority neighborhoods and disadvantaged neighborhoods as well. There's also a very interesting hearing on the Goetz program in Chicago in 1978, congressional hearing that took place in Chicago on the very question of whether the Goetz resolution was not unfairly and unnecessarily limiting housing assistance in central parts of the city of Chicago. That the new Goetz program and the restrictions on development in large parts of the city was starving those parts of the city, those neighborhoods, of needed housing assistance, according to some people, and according to others, those restrictions were necessary in order to reverse this pattern of segregation that was so prominent in the city of Chicago. This conflict exhibits itself continually in terms of divergent interpretations of the Fair Housing Act, and what I mean here really is simply the relative importance given to non-discrimination or anti-discrimination on the one hand and integration on the other, right? Most observers of the Fair Housing Act agree that there are two objectives in the act. One is to deal with problems of discrimination in the housing market. This is an aspatial kind of objective, that is, We are to address issues of discrimination wherever they occur and regardless of the spatial patterns that they produce, on the one hand. On the other hand, it's also widely accepted that the Fair Housing Act is about integration or dealing with patterns of segregation. Of course, the words integration and segregation do not appear in the Fair Housing Act. Those objectives have been read into the Act, though, by court after court, sometimes with reference to some of the congressional debates that preceded enactment of the Act in 1968. Chief among them, quotes offered by then Senator Walter Mondale of Minnesota, one of the chief sponsors of the bill. So I want to talk about something I alluded to earlier, the spatial strategy of fair housing and how that has evolved over time. Because I think that this is what's creating this impasse, this growing tension between the two movements, the fair housing movement on the one hand and community development on the other hand. When the fair housing movement was young and new in the 40s and the 50s, it was actually frequently called the open housing movement. And it was called the open housing movement because its chief aim was to create opportunities for housing where they did not currently exist for people of color. So this was opening up exclusionary communities. Frequently these were suburban communities, but it was also large parts of American cities that were limiting the housing choices of people of color. And so the target was discrimination, often overt violence and intimidation against people of color. It was things like racially restricted deeds and covenants, but also racially biased and exclusionary zoning, right? The objective here was to increase choice by reducing or removing barriers for people of color in a large number of American communities. That was, I think, what I call the first station of fair housing advocacy. The second station of fair housing advocacy goes beyond the first to address the question of preventing further ghetto formation or further patterns of segregation. And so here the issue is, where are we putting our assisted housing, and are we siting it systematically in communities of color that continue processes of segregation? What can we do to affirmatively further fair housing? The 1970s and the 80s saw the initiation of different types of integration maintenance programs, which had as their objective to avoid further concentration of people of color and to create patterns of integration and then to maintain those patterns as well. Housing integration maintenance programs often operated by limiting the entry of people of color into a community so as to avoid resegregation of those communities. So again, here the second station of fair housing spatial strategy being to prevent further ghetto formation. The third station of fair housing advocacy is then to move even further beyond the second, to actually break up existing concentrations of people of color, existing concentrations of segregation, etc. And so here, of course, we have the Hope 6 program, we have public housing demolition and conversion, we have various desegregation lawsuits that worked by essentially reinventing these large concentrations of public housing that were dominated by people of color, and these were pursued in metropolitan areas all across the country. So here again is an even more interventionist strategy that says that existing concentrations, not only should they not be perpetuated by policies that would add more such housing to these areas, but we actually have to proactively move into these communities and either facilitate the movement of people out of those communities, or actually force the movement of people out of those communities through demolition of the housing, et cetera. So through these forced mobility and resegregation types of policies. The first of these stations of fair housing strategy, the first of these does not create a necessary problem or conflict with community development. It's the second and the third stations of fair housing, which have evolved over time and have grown more and more important over time, that introduce and then really bring to the forefront this conflict between fair housing and community development. And it has really manifested itself in a number of different ways. First of all, we've had a couple decades now of legal action related to the implementation of the low-income housing tax credit program in the United States. We've had the three that I'm going to sort of focus on are a lawsuit in New Jersey in the early 2000s, the ICP versus the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs case, which made it to the Supreme Court last summer or the summer before, and then some complaints against HUD and local governments in the Twin Cities, in the region where I'm from. And so all of these are challenges to the way that the low-income housing tax credit has been implemented in communities across the country. And the allegation on the part of fair housing advocates is that this program, like previous programs of assisted housing, is being concentrated in communities of color. It's being concentrated in disadvantaged, in economically disadvantaged communities, and that we need to stop this pattern and change that pattern. This is a quote from the staff attorney in the New Jersey fair housing case, where he very emphatically makes the argument and really sort of dismisses the contention on the part of community developers that what they do has a positive impact in the community. He's not having any of that, right? It challenges the notion that new affordable housing in these neighborhoods is fundamentally helpful for revitalization. It's not so, they say. And this is the foundation of the suit. That if the community developers, if what the community developers are doing in these neighborhoods is not really resulting in revitalization, then all it's doing is concentrating more poor people in these communities. And the litigants in New Jersey went right at that argument. That argument is also being challenged currently in other parts of the country. So we have a fair housing advocate in the Twin Cities who refers to the community development industry as the poverty housing industry, which is a nice, very, very colorful phrase, which is meant to cast aspersions on the motivations and the impacts of community developers and the work that they do in the Twin Cities. These are very aggressive attacks on the community development industry. There's no other way really of saying that. And it's the basis of the Minneapolis complaints as well. The tax credit program and the litigation against it has really spawned a whole bunch of research on the very question of where are tax credit units going, and are they actually being concentrated unnecessarily in certain parts of metropolitan areas? Are they contributing to patterns of segregation, etc.? And so the good thing about that is that this controversy is providing us with research opportunities. In 2012, the National Low-Income Housing Coalition published a report which addressed this issue head-on. They call it the Affordable Housing Dilemma, the preservation versus mobility debate. Preservation is part of it, but it's more than certainly preservation, right? We're talking about new housing in these types of communities as well. But this is 30-some pages directly addressing this question of what should be done, and as you might guess, given the source of the report, there is a defense in that report for the continued building of affordable housing in communities where it's needed and where even fair housing advocates might object. The Ford Foundation and the Open Society Foundation sponsored meetings throughout throughout 2012 and 13, I think, on between advocates in the two camps to try to iron out these problems between fair housers on the one hand and community developers on the other hand. And they came after some time to a set of principles on the intersection of community development and fair housing, which were published in November of 2012. And although I have really quite briefly summarized them, I don't think I've done major damage to the sentiment here. But the first of the principles is that we do need to give families a choice by both working in low-income communities to improve them, but also working to open up opportunities for housing in areas that are not currently accessible. Which I assume is another way of saying the second bullet, and that is that we have to balance our housing investments. We have to find out ways of improving and increasing housing accessibility in opportunity neighborhoods, but also reinvesting as much as possible in central city neighborhoods. And then finally, the third one is that we have to really incentivize affordable housing in opportunity areas, and we can talk about what the assumption is behind that in a second. So, you know, at some level, the solution to this debate between community developers and fair housers is obvious. We need a balance. We need both. End of conversation. Well, that's not really the end of the conversation for a number of reasons. First of all, although we can agree in principle on a balance, that agreement doesn't really give us any guidance about what to do for any specific proposed project, right? So this debate plays itself out in the context of proposals that are made for housing in some areas that are denied in other areas, etc., right? And how can we translate this long-term balance between the two into a specific set of actions or guidelines for any individual problem? Second, what do we mean by balance? And where should we balance these things? So balance between what types of neighborhoods and how are they defined and how are they measured? But if we could do that and agree upon that, and I would argue that our experience to date on what is an opportunity neighborhood and how it should be measured and mapped suggests that we're not quite there in terms of an agreement about where to balance things. We would have to come to some agreement about what is the appropriate balance. So are we talking about a one-for-one balance between building in community development areas versus opportunity areas? Are we talking about a per capita balance? Are we talking about a balance relative to the existing need? Are we talking about a balance that is somehow an inverse of what we've done previously so as to change the geography of opportunity? And that's a debate that we really haven't had as well, and would require some resolution before we operationalize this balance thing. Finally, who's going to do the balancing? Most metropolitan areas don't have a centralized authority to make these decisions. We can talk perhaps about the state QAP for the tax credit program, but that's just one program, albeit the largest. Without an actor to coordinate activities of the fair housers on the one hand and the community developers on the other hand, it's not entirely clear about how we go about coordinating these activities. I will say that the fair housing activists often claim that community developers and affordable housing developers are following what they call a path of least resistance. That they build housing where it's not opposed. They build housing where there aren't significant obstacles to it. Political but economic obstacles as well. And this is a criticism that one sees frequently made of community developers. I think it's worth pointing out that as you trace the evolution of fair housing spatial advocacy, one can increasingly say the same thing of fair housers. That their policy is a policy of least resistance. Given two different possible objectives, opening up exclusionary, predominantly white communities with significant political opposition and economic power, or trying to stop the development of affordable housing in predominantly minority communities, they are increasingly moving in that direction. It is their own path of least resistance. They have discovered what the NIMBYists have known for a long time, that it's easier to stop affordable housing than it is to build it. And that's what they're doing at this point. Sorry, that was sort of an aside. It may not have been exactly on point. But it occurred to me and I didn't want to do that. All right, I've talked about that. And so what else has happened recently? The Supreme Court ruling in 2015 in the Texas tax credit case. So this was a case that is frequently heralded, and it was actually a great success for fair housing. The Supreme Court ruled in that disparate impact was an actionable cause under the Fair Housing Act. That is, that one could sue on the effect of discrimination and not have to show intent to discriminate, right? So disparate impact. But what some fair housing advocates and some notable New York Times columnists tend to not understand is that this was not the Supreme Court weighing in on the substance of the debate between community developers and fair housers, right? Because the Supreme Court said as much in at least 5 different places in the decision that they are not saying, and it would be difficult to say as a general matter, that building low-income housing in a blighted city, inner city neighborhood is discriminatory. And that this disparate impact liability does not mandate any particular type of strategy on the part of housing developers and community developers, and that it should not force housing authorities to reorder their priorities. And they note that it would be paradoxical for the Fair Housing Act to insert itself in such a way and to impose such onerous costs on those who are trying to revitalize declining parts of American cities. I especially like the last half of the last clause in the sentence, merely because some other priority might seem preferable. I'm not sure I would have stated it quite like that, but that's the way they talked about it. So the decision by the Supreme Court was not a decision on the actual merits of either the fair housing or the community development argument on this. And then finally it gets us to the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, HUD's new rule from 2015, it was the same year, right? And I only want to note that it equivocates in exactly the same way that the Supreme Court did. That the duty to affirmatively further fair housing does not dictate any particular investment strategy, nor does it preclude any as a matter of law, right? That HUD's rule recognizes that there is a place for place-based strategies to improve conditions in high poverty neighborhoods. And so you see the same sort of position taken by HUD in this. I will say that I think that the AFFH rule does, I think, come down more on the side of the fair housing argument. There is this in the rule as well, that in areas with a history of segregation, which by the way is just about every city in the United States, if a program participant, a local housing authority, has the ability to create opportunities outside of these segregated neighborhoods, and they don't, that this is probably something that could be subject to a legitimate claim relative to affirmatively furthering fair housing. The question, of course, is whether most community developers and community development corporations have the ability to create opportunities in areas outside of segregated, and how they define the ability to create such housing outside of low-income neighborhoods. But I think that that's something that will be worked out as the rule is implemented, and we'll see that going forward. Finally, our current Secretary of HUD has weighed in as well, and has, when directly asked, also said, no, all that we're doing in the area of AFFH and strengthening fair housing, that doesn't mean that we're shifting our gaze completely away from central city neighborhoods, from community revitalization. We know we need to invest in them. We know we shouldn't forget about them. They do have value, etc. And so, even at the very top of the agency, you see this dual understanding. And this, of course, is a tension that has been within HUD for decades, right? The Fair Housing Office within HUD can barely speak to the other parts of the agency because they feel that the other parts of the agency regularly renege on the promises of the Fair Housing Act as well. So if there's ever been an agency with a split personality on a particular topic, it's HUD about this. Finally, as I wrap up, the Chetty findings have added to the debate. Some people argue that, well, this clinches it for the mobility folks. Ignoring, of course, that it's that the positive findings finally, by the way, after 15 years of looking at the MTO data, we're able to finally find positive economic outcomes. That those are limited to children of a certain age, and that those benefits themselves are limited in ways as well. I've already made a sideways reference to Edsel, and I'm not sure what I meant by that third bullet, except for I think what I wanted to type in and forgot to was the preoccupation that HUD requires of local governments with what they call racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty, RECAPs. That we have to study our RECAPs. Our new AFFH rule requires that we study those RECAPs, that we identify where they are, that we identify strategies for those. And I think it's probably worth noting that our social scientists over the years have shown fairly effectively that segregation is actually a greater problem among whites than any community of color. And segregation is higher at the high end of the income distribution than it is at the lower end of the income distribution. But HUD isn't really asking us to study what you might call white caps. These white areas of concentrated affluence. That's really not on the radar screen. And the direction towards these recaps very significantly orients the way we go about our public policy, what we think are legitimate topics and targets of public policy, and what aren't. And so the absence of any noise about whitecaps, I think, is instructive as well. Finally, I'll whip through the 5 urban planning implications. We can talk about those. One, HUD is trying to move towards this notion of housing and transportation affordability, and this is what they call the location affordability index. The fair housers were all over that in a hurry, all right? Because they knew that following a housing and transportation index might lead you to the conclusion that we should build more affordable housing where there is affordable transit. Heaven forbid we should do that, because if we did, we would be, perpetuating segregation. And so they didn't mind the idea of a location affordability index. What they minded was using that index as a way of citing affordable housing. And that it's certainly inappropriate and paternalistic, which is quite a claim for a fair housing attorney. Second, opportunity mapping. Our field is moving in the direction of identifying opportunity neighborhoods, defining them, mapping them, etc. Often to come to one summary map that you can usefully look at and say, oh, here is the area or the areas of opportunity in my metropolitan area, and here are the areas that aren't full of opportunities. And I love that simplification. It would be wonderful if the world were so simple, and it would be wonderful if opportunity weren't defined in 16 different ways by people who live in communities. I think what we need to do is find a way of reflecting that nuance in the way that we measure opportunity, etc. But nevertheless, it's a very important factor. Transit-oriented development, right? So also and this is all not that new, a major movement in the field of urban planning. And the question is, what are the implications for TOD of this debate about maintaining or perpetuating segregation and segregation patterns? The question of urban sustainability, right? The Obama administration made a large push towards improving the efficiency of land use, urban forms, coordinating transit and housing investments. But again, all of those things work in a direction opposite of the way that fair housing advocates essentially want them to work relative to where we place affordable housing. And then finally, complicating all of this is the changing structure of opportunity in metropolitan areas, right? I'm not sure we need to go so far as to say that our metropolitan areas are indeed inverting themselves, but in fact we do know that most poor people now live in the suburbs, most immigrants live in the suburbs, most people of color live in suburbs than in central cities, right? We've got an increasingly complex structure of opportunity in our metropolitan areas, and it's not quite so simple as it used to be in terms of this opposition of central city to suburb in terms of how we target our affordable housing, etc. All right, so I've thrown a lot on the plate, and thanks for listening, and I look forward to the conversation.
It's kind of hard to follow. I think I don't have a lot of disagreement here, so I think I'm going to try to extend and embellish a little bit. I'm glad to see a couple of people I know in the room, because otherwise I'd tell the joke that I tell all the time, so I'm going to save some time. But I will say that the punchline of the joke has to do with the fact that in the work that I do and the way I approach things, the punchline of this joke has to do with the worm. And to me, race is the worm in the apple. It's the thing I tend to always come back to. But the other part of the joke is I used to tell this joke to my students, and the point of the joke was no matter what the teacher asks, you always answer what you know. And so I will tend to talk about what I know now as I do this. And I should say that although I've done fair housing work, and I'm embarrassed to say I used to work at HUD, I don't do a lot of housing work anymore, and my perspective on things is a little bit different. And so I want to try to be a little bit provocative today. And I also want to mention that I do come down on one side of these debates, and I remember being in a forum by there's this thing here called the Housing Report Card, you know, which that's produced every year. With great fanfare, it's released. And I get it every year, and I look and I see if fair housing is mentioned. And fair housing never mentioned it. And I remember going to a forum and it was being presented, and I said, well, what about the kind of people? And a very prominent member of our affordable housing community stood up and said, David, this is about production. This isn't about the people. Well, I have a serious issue with that, and I want to play a little clip right now that I think frames exactly why we need to understand that this is about people. It's a short clip from one of my favorite controversial movies, Crash. It's one of the best things.
How's it going? You didn't get scared or something, did you? There's no monsters sometimes, because I hate monsters.
There's such thing as monsters.
Oh, that's a good thing.
Like a bang,
Like a truck bang?
like a gun.
That's funny, because we moved out of that bad neighborhood. There's not too many guns around here.
How far can bullets go?
They go pretty far, but they usually get stuck in something and stuck.
And if they don't,
Thinking about that bullet that came through the window? You think we should move again?
I like it here.
Me too, but if that bullet fell out where we live. Oh, hold on.
What?
Oh, I'm so stupid. How could I forget?
What?
Nah, forget it. You ain't gonna.
Tell me.
Okay. When I was 5, this fairy came into my room one night. See, I told you you weren't gonna believe me. Okay, go to sleep now, you little
Don't
rat.
tell me.
Okay. So this fairy comes into my room, and I'm like, yeah, right, you're a fairy. And then like, we're talking, you know, and she's flying all around the room, knocking down all my posters and stuff.
She was so mean.
Yeah, but she had these little stubby wings. I mean, she could have blew mine, you know? Like, I'm gonna believe she's a fairy. So she said, I'll prove it. So she reaches into her backpack. She pulls out this invisible cloak. She ties it around my neck. And she tells me that it's impenetrable. You know what impenetrable means? It means that nothing can go through it. No bullets, nothing. She told me that if I wore it, nothing would hurt me. So I did. And my whole life, I never got shot, stabbed, nothing. I mean, how weird is that? Only she told me that I was supposed to give it to my daughter on her 5th birthday, and I forgot.
Did you take it?
Sugar.
I don't feel it.
Yeah, it's pretty cool, huh? You want to take it off and tie it around your shoulders? She told me how to do it. I just think it's stupid.
Don't you need it?
So what do you think you want? Okay, let's get out of here. Okay. daughter. When she turns 5, then you give it to her.
So I show that clip because I want us to keep in mind and understand that we're talking about real people. We're talking about, these are actors, but we're talking about moving, we're talking about safety, we're talking about a whole bunch of things, and I want us not to lose track of the fact that all our policy debates and all the stuff we talk about is related to real people who have real lives and who have real families and who care about their children and all that kind of stuff. So at the Houston Institute, we actually think that we need to have a strategy that changes the way we organize social policy. We think that our cities have been destroyed and our communities of color have been overrun as a result of the war on drugs, and they've been devastated by decades of disinvestment, and it's time for us to reverse that. So I come down on one side of this debate that you've heard about today, and it should be pretty clear which. But I think about the way we craft policies. And one of the things that I wonder about is, so from our perspective, the way to do public policy, it's time now to give voices to those people whose voices haven't been heard, who have been systematically excluded from policy debates and discussions. So one idea I have for thinking about how we do housing policy is, how about we ask people what's important to them? What makes for a good community? What are they looking for in their community? Ask that question across a region, right? And I would speculate, based on what we know, that the answers you get is that people across a region want pretty much the same thing. What do they want? They want safe, affordable housing. They want access to schools, access to fresh food, access to transportation, access to employment, the ability for their children to go out and play. So the point is that fulfilling those needs should be our public policy imperative. But what do? We create this idea of some high opportunity neighborhoods where those things are available, and then we have the cities. We have the other neighborhoods. And what we do is we propose a crapshoot. We propose a public policy that says, well, let's let some people move. Let's create a little bit of affordable housing that allows some people access to those things. Okay? And what happens to the rest of it? What happens to those left behind? We do the same thing in schools. Let's create some charter schools. We'll let some kids go to charter schools, and the rest of the kids, they just didn't have to win a lottery. But I don't think that our public policy should be based like that. And as Ed said, there's this question about balance and all that, and so HUD has this wonderful notion of doing both and, right? So their idea is we can do both and. We can do both kind of opening up the suburbs, and we can do both development in cities. Well, we can't. How many people have heard of an index of dissimilarity? What does it mean? Anybody? What does it mean? What does it measure? All right, come on, I'm not really a teacher anymore, so I shouldn't do that. It's a measure that tells you in theory how many people would have to move to create a truly segregated community, right? Now, even if you don't know anything, you know that most of our metropolitan areas have indexes of dissimilarity. They're huge, right? So now, it's not designed for real policy formulation, but think about how many people would have to move to create the kind of desegregation that we're talking about. You can't do it. We can't move our way out of this. But not only that, we're talking about policies that conflate things, right? We're talking about poverty. We're talking about concentrations of poverty. And we talk about breaking it up. We don't talk about ending poverty, right? We worry about the concentration. Well, come on. So what happens if you move somebody, if somebody wins the lottery and gets a voucher that they can take to the suburb, but still doesn't have a job, still doesn't have a car? So people argue that it doesn't do us any good to improve conditions in areas of concentrated poverty if you aren't doing other things. Well, it doesn't do any good to move somebody to the suburbs if they don't have a job and they don't have a car. You haven't accomplished anything. What have you done? You've deconcentrated. And what's the language we use? when Ed read the passage, it was there, break up. Break up. Let's break up these areas of concentrated poverty. It's a violent image. It's a violent image. It's a violent way that we approach and attack what we do in this country. The language we use tells us an incredible amount, right? The way we talk about things. So I have this idea. So Edsel, I'm going to pick on him, right? Has this article in the New York Times, and when he talks about, he contrasts impoverished or derelict tracts with upscale opportunity. So just think about the language you use. So I have this idea that if we, I do this little exercise to say, let's try to think about an area of concentrated poverty. Just close your eyes, create an image in your mind of a neighborhood that is concentrated poverty, or let's say broken windows, right? In some area. Right? Just a neighborhood. Now populate it, put some people in it, okay? See what they look like. All right? Now let's think about a nice, high opportunity, upscale, suburban neighborhood. Okay. Put the people in it. Okay. So my suspicion is that as a nation, we populate those areas by race. That this represents a form of bias about communities, similar to the form of bias we talk about implicit bias in individuals. And those biases creep not only into us, and not only into our journalism, which they do. I'll read you a passage from the Boston Globe from a couple of weeks ago that makes the point, but also policymakers. My God, these people are going around making policies about how to spend our resources, how to craft incentives, how to do the work that we do, and they have these images of communities that they carry around with them. And those images are that some images of concentrated poverty are not worthy, and others aren't. So the Globe recently, how many people saw the piece in the Globe about 2 weeks ago about affordable housing, right? I said, this is made my blood boil. I literally was just, my poor wife said, David, you need to get up and talk to somebody about that. Well, you're it, I'm sorry. She said, I can't hear it anymore. Right? It's terrible because I don't know how many of you noticed it, but through this beautiful leisure domain, the article started out talking about affordable housing, and it ended up talking about race. Right? It was unbelievable. So this was going to be a story about. So he started with this description of these two neighborhoods, describing Lexington as a suburb of gracious colonials and lofty SAT scores. Probably accurate. I mean, I live in Bedford, so I know what's over there in Lexington. But then it contrasted that with one of the main characters of the story who came from a tough slice of Dorchester, where the family had to steer around drug dealers and gun shops outside their building. Then it's only at the end of the article when you start to talk about the 1989 settlement here in Boston that created housing vouchers that were designed to, quote, move minority families, at least for time, into predominantly white and generally better communities. So again, I think, what I want, this is the way our policy formulations go. We don't call it we don't say what we're talking about, we don't talk about what needs to be done, and we nibble around the edges. All right? So I'm going to stop because I think we need to have some conversation. But I think on some levels in this debate, the CDCs are a boogeyman because it's not the CDCs; it's the people in the communities. It's the people in the communities who say it's time for us, right, to create incentives and opportunities here in our community. And it doesn't have to do with whether you have affordable housing or not. It has to do with what we as a nation decide we're going to do as a policy framework to ensure that the goal of fair housing, which to my mind is choice, right? Is choice. Is my neighborhood in Dorchester gives me everything I want. But if I wanted that in a suburban community, I could go get it, right? But if I didn't want it in a suburban community, I could stay here and I don't have to move. Okay? And so the other reason I show that clip, and I don't know how many of you have seen Crash, but this family is the kind of the heart and soul of that film. And this guy, and it's interesting that he's a Latino. I mean, people think about this, there's a lot of black folks, and Crash looks like it's about race and all this stuff. But the fact is that we're talking about people who care deeply about their families. You know, these aren't abstractions. You know, the policy work we do can't be detached from the real needs and lived experience of people. So, now we have a little chat, I guess. Thank you.
Now we'd like to open it up for questions. I'd like
Right, so I wanted to start, I think the point about asking communities what they want from fair housing, I think is well taken, but isn't that what the new rule does? Is that not the basis of that new rule? To actually go out into the communities and have them develop their fair housing plans?
I didn't pay you to ask that, did I?
No.
I'll pay you later. Well, in theory, yes, but yes. I mean, that's the one thing about the new rule that I have thought of as positive, except for the fact that it's high. Right? So, no, I'm serious. So, and I've looked at the rule very closely, and one of the interesting things, and one of the really positive things about it is that it calls for, it replaces the language of outreach, which is HUD's kind of historical phrase for that community input, with engagement. So you actually see the word engagement used a couple of times, right? And I think that's good, because I always talk about preferring engagement to outreach. But in HUD's hands, and in most of these participants' hands, it's the same as outreach. So if by that what we mean, so there's no, for instance, metric, there's nothing that measures that. There's no reporting on it aside to say that you had something. And there's no requirement that that happen in an ongoing way, right? So the opportunity is there, and my point is that we're working with people here in Boston to make sure that people in communities keep the heat on to make sure that that happens. But just by it having been said doesn't mean it's going to happen. It still requires the people in the community. It still requires people on the ground forcing the issue and keeping it in line.
So also full disclosure, I actually work for HUD.
Of course, in fair housing?
Yeah.
Let me see if there's any other way I can insult you. Sorry. No, I would say that's a great topic for a dissertation, right? I mean, to what extent then is this new commitment to engagement in being honored, and how does that and so how's it playing out in metropolitan areas?
And what impact does it have? I mean, what's your understanding of how the different?
Well, again, I've been here for 3 weeks, so. but the way that the rule is written, you know, one element of it is to go back and make sure that the actual metrics have changed, and it won't happen until the new, this is the year that I don't know all the terminology yet. But so it's a long-term thing, but it is something that is based in data, and so that's, you know, as an executive agency, we can't, you know, pass new laws, we can't, you know, go out and, you know, do the groundwork like you guys can, but as far as a way to measure it, that's the closest.
But the data that they're talking about, I mean, it's true that it is an incredibly data-driven process, but they're not talking about engagement data. You know, they're talking about the kind of data that go into these opportunity indices. That's my understanding of most of what the data are. that HUD is providing, and they're providing that to people in communities so they can start to talk about it.
Right. And they can make plans based on, their own understanding of their communities and the data points that they think are important. Sorry.
Give my regards to your colleague. Tell them that David was talking about me.
Teamwork scandal.
So, thank you both for those really interesting and provocative comments. And I feel like I want to play devil's advocate, so I feel like I want to get some disagreement. First of all, I want to highlight one area where I thought you two disagreed, and then I want to just throw out kind of a little bit of defense of some of those fair housing advocates, or what their arguments is. I mean, one, it does seem that you disagreed a little bit on the degree to which we understand what an opportunity area is, and we understand about the kind of communities people want to live in. And it seemed like, David, you seem pretty clear that we know that it's pretty likely people would agree if, regardless of who they are and where they live, people have that similar idea about what it is makes the community a desirable place to live. And Ed, I think you were a little more cynical about that, so I'd love you to talk about that. But also just from a one phrase that didn't come out of, I think, either of your mouths was concerted revitalization strategy. And I think that, I think what fair housing advocates are arguing, and granted there are some that are more extreme than others, and Ed, you happen to live very near to one of them that's quite, I think a little bit, it's not quite a straw man because he exists, but he is at one extreme. But I think that, I think the argument is that it's not so much we should never invest and we should never build or preserve housing. It's just that we should, in high poverty neighborhoods or high poverty racially concentrated areas, but that we should think hard about what kinds of investments we need to make to ensure that we're not only building housing or preserving housing, but we're also improving those communities and trying to make every community a community of choice and opportunity.
So so let me say more about opportunities and opportunity neighborhoods and measures. And it's true, that was an aside, and it was a quick response, and I didn't explain it fully. It was really, to some extent, a judgment on the state of the field, on how we're measuring opportunity, and the increasing understanding that there are different dimensions to opportunity. There's economic dimensions of opportunity, there are social dimensions of opportunity, and that neighborhoods, therefore, can be simultaneously very high on some forms of opportunity and very low on other forms of opportunity. Most of the opportunity maps will acknowledge all of that, and then we'll actually even provide you a map of crime as one form of negative opportunity, even health, jobs, schools, right? So they'll show you. But there's an almost irresistible urge then to, at the one hand, acknowledge that diversity and then clump them all together in one summary map, which does considerable damage to the whole idea of and everything, all of the analysis they've done, prior to that stage. So it was really a criticism of that sort of tendency in the field. The second thing is, I think it matters very much how things like the new AFFH rule and the Supreme Court decision, how they are interpreted by local officials who may never have read either one, right? And who hear about them as they are reported or as they are described by others. And so to a large extent, it doesn't matter if I can find those quotes in both the decision and the rule itself that says weigh things. If the officials say, there's a new sheriff in town, we can't do that kind of housing anymore, it's got to go out to these other places, then that's significant and really consequential.
So, and I hate to say it, but I don't think I disagree. I don't think there's a disagreement here. I think you might have misinterpreted what I said, because I agree about the opportunity indexing. I think it's terribly flawed. And I think that although I was talking on the level of values and what people value, not what people measure, right? And so I think, in point of fact, people in communities might create a quite different opportunity mix. They might in fact say, we have a number of organizations that are working in our community that don't wind up in your index, but they are highly valued and very important to us, if you ask. Not if you created your index based on your social life, but you come ask us, right? That's the first thing. The second thing is, I will say that the reason that I forgot, the other reason that I showed that clip is because I think if we tend to think, and that guy in Minnesota's brother out in Stanford drives the education debate in a very similar way, would say that people want to move to high opportunity areas for access to education, for those SAT scores, right? But in point of fact, I think what this clip shows, I think that a lot of people want to get out of those areas because of their fear of violence, right? I think violence, I think if you, I think, it's an empirical question. It's an empirical question.
One thing, of course, it's not in the HUD.
Right. And so what my argument is that violence is a fair housing issue.
I totally agree.
That you can't address fair housing unless you address the issues and the circumstances that create and that go along with those concentrations. Right? And that's not going to happen. And until we do that, we're not going to solve anything. Until we confront that, people, so again, my wife is a tear, thank God. I know.
I really enjoyed this. Full disclosure, I work in the place-based neighborhood kind of approach, in particular with an approach that might look at a community that is 100% public assistance and say, is there a way that we can have a gradation of incomes in the same place? And is there a way that we can create amenities that therefore increase the income base within that community? And I guess listening to y'all, and this is similar to the feeling that I have almost every time we work in a community that's invited us, I guess there's always a tension between what the community that can see real opportunity from partnering with us would get out of the situation versus what the town hall or city hall or the school district might see. From the school district and the city hall, they say, well, why can't we do this systemically across the city? And we're like, well, we've come up with a way to provide it for you in this one place. And I came away from, and it may not have been your intent, but I came away from the way that you two presented your arguments. I think that you were arguing for a sense of nuance around this, but I almost heard it as an attack on attempts to take practical steps where there are opportunities. And so I'd love if you could just help distinguish those things. If you can't change the system, if you're like me and you're not in a position where you can, but you find an opportunity to create positive change in a way that reconciles a lot of the fair housing and affordable housing discussions, what should be your new lens to determine whether it's worth it or whether it's too piecemeal to be worth it?
So, I mean, it's a good question. I think, I'm not sure that I meant to leave the impression that I've left. Because for me, the issue has to do with people in a community having a voice. And, one of the ways to do that is through a very particular initiative of some sort, right? And to have a victory of some sort. And having the victory reinforces a sense of agency to then take on another battle, right? And then to build on that, right? So, I'm not sure about that, but that's what I'm talking about. I mean, it's not, because this doesn't end, and no, you're not going to fix it all at once. But if we're talking about communities that have been voiceless and marginalized over time, the point is to kind of be able to mobilize those voices in support of any particular initiative that might in fact accomplish one small thing, and that victory then keeps people engaged going forward. And that's what I mean about engagement, about it needing to be enduring. We need to think about it and recognize those forms of engagement that succeed in keeping people involved in the policy, in the formulation of policies.
I just want to say that I also agree really sort of emphatically about the importance of the voices of people who live in these communities. The other thing that I didn't mention about this notion of both and strategy is that we live in an era of incredible scarcity in terms of the resources that are devoted to these things. And so we're never going to get anywhere close to both and. We're never going to be getting anywhere close to meeting the need in either location. And what we're talking about doing is exceedingly difficult. I mean, the work that CDCs do and affordable housing developers do is exceedingly difficult. And so I'm not nearly as bothered by reactions and opportunities. Boy, is there another word? Kind of development opportunities that developers face and then react.
So can I just, one thing, I mean, on the resource issue, I'll say, I think it's true that we're hard pressed to do both and, but I vehemently challenge the notion that we don't have the resources to rebuild our cities. Right? And I challenge it, and I challenge it in this way, because so long as we have all these separate budgets and these silos of funding and activity that aren't related, that aren't coordinated, that don't understand a problem that's systemic, then it looks like we don't have the resources, and that's because we're not using them effectively.
Great. We're going to give a round of applause to our speakers.